book called The Daily Undoing, Being Better at Being Human. What made you start creating this book?
It was a podcast initially.
Okay.
About a year and a half into the podcast, which was a daily podcast, I decided that I wanted to bring more focus to it. And that area of focus, which had always been sort of lurking in the periphery, was this concept of competency-based learning, which is a methodology that really isn't worth getting into here. I mean, it isn't worth getting into because it's sort of pivotal. But in short, it's teaching through actions over reading and memorization. Wouldn't you know it? My landline going off. I don't even know where my phone is.
That's okay. It's all good.
So I'd always been teaching using these tools that I had never really identified as competencies, right, in the academic pedagogical way. But it turns out years after I started to teach, I had been doing some research for a textbook project and discovered that these competencies were part of a framework called competency-based learning. And they were super important, not only for students to learn, but for future employers to leverage from those graduated students. And I thought, wait a minute, I've always been teaching critical thinking, and I've always encouraged curiosity, and I've always challenged students to think critically. I've been doing all this stuff. And so the podcast took a very distinct focus on these competencies in 2020. And the plan was always to replicate that in some way into a print version that I would release at the end of the year. And so that was the genesis of it. It was very purposeful and intentional. It was basically to bring this notion of these sort of superpowers, I call them, that we all have inside of us that we never really take time to practice. And we practice all of these things, whether it be our basketball shot or working on our six-pack or being a better cook. These things that we all have in abundance, but we just don't practice them. And I truly felt that practicing them is a pathway to being better at being human.
Dave, why don't we practice them?
All right.
Why don't we practice
these? I thought we were going to get into the book and you were going to challenge me.
I was going to.
Why don't we? I think hubris. I think we all believe that they're just there, ready to perform at peak levels when needed, right? So, you get sick, and that's when curiosity kicks in. You want to research the symptomology, the cures, the natural remedies. You go to friends, you go to experts. Curiosity kicks in when you need it. Same with critical thinking. You have to untangle a really complicated problem. And suddenly you're forced into this realm where you need to really, truly think and examine both sides of the story. And you find yourself a bit handcuffed, a bit short, right? And you're frustrated with it. You can't summon up this peak performance of these competencies. So I think we just, again, it's hubris or it's arrogance, whatever it is that we human beings all possess. We just feel we're born with these things, thus they are dispensed when we need them.
Oh, for sure. Were you always a critical thinker, or did you learn to become a critical thinker?
One of the premises of competency-based learning, this whole framework of competencies, is that you spend a lifetime pursuing mastery, but never really attaining it. Their mastery in critical thinking or collaboration or creativity is always there, kind of like a carrot at the end of the stick, that those who kind of get into this feel compelled to always chase, but never, there's no degrees of black belt in competencies, right? You're always pursuing peak performance. So with critical thinking or any of these things, I would like to think that I was and am always fair and objective in my analysis of situations, be they simple or complex. This process of writing the book, of doing a podcast, and tracing my way back to a textbook project that I worked on years ago that sort of spurred this, I think has made me better at critical thinking. The thing that I've always felt that I have had a strong willingness to be is curiosity. If you were to ask me which of these eight things come most naturally to me, it's probably curiosity. And yet, I'm having said that, I'm as deficient. I'm no more supplied with it than anyone else. I just love learning and asking questions, even when it doesn't really matter, right? It could be mundane. It could be just a happenstance. And I just love the inquiry into it.
Are you able to take all those answers that you get and put them into or connect the dots, or is that difficult for you as well?
In curiosity, like in intellectual curiosity, it is. You can. Oftentimes, it's equally rewarding though if you don't, if you're still left with questions.
Mm.
Um, I run this activity in my innovation and design course at SAIT. I run it about halfway through every year when students are becoming a little bit antsy and wondering exactly what their prof is up to. And I say, and this is we even did this in the virtual era here, although it was a little more difficult. But I have students get up and go out of their classroom, and I have them position themselves at just some random place. I say, walk 15 minutes in any direction on campus and plant your butt there with a notebook and just watch, observe, and take notes. And this is an activity that comes from a French novelist from the 1970s. And I love this activity because it forces you to notice what he called the infraordinary. And his assertion was that the only things that we really talk about are the extraordinary, where 99% of our lives are what happens in between those events. And it's fascinating when you just sit and observe. I think, watching and knowing you the little that I do, I feel you're one of those
Yeah.
types of people as well. You could sit on a park bench all afternoon,
Yep.
just watch and wonder, right? So, and yet you don't always know. In fact, you rarely know what's going on in someone's head. Why pigeons landed on that corner of the table. What was the attraction to, to this outcome of that cause? And sometimes that's, to me, it's equally rewarding when you're left still questioning.
What do you ask your students to write when they're observing? What are they looking forward to writing, or for writing?
Yeah. And I think this is what really makes them crazy, because students always want parameters and structure. And to a question like that, which comes up a lot, right? As they're muttering to themselves walking out the door. What are we supposed to do? And I say, I don't know. Just do. Be. Sit, watch. Do you remember how to write by hand? um, with a notebook? Many of them don't have notebooks, so I allow them to take their laptops or even do it on a memo in their phone. But um, what springs to mind? What are you thinking when you see a mundane activity? What does it make you think? How does it make you think? And part of the challenge is that if it doesn't make them think about anything, well, there's proof of my argument that their curiosity needs to be activated. Right? It's right there, as pure as the day. Something just crumbled in my kitchen.
Good. Making popcorn?
No, and a fork or a knife
Oh,
dropping. Yeah, very very thin floorboards here.
I'm pretty old school. I mean, I use still pen and paper for a lot of things. As much as I am digital, I still love writing on paper. There's something about it.
Yeah, well, there is certainly scientific proof that that physical activity does deliver more synapses in your brain, much more than keyboards or watching or reading. That physical activity, and that's why the book is one of the reasons why the book is structured the way it is. There's lots of room, as I say in the book. I've just given you the outline. The book is there for you to fill in the blanks and write the story as you interpret these things. So there's a lot of empty space there.
How much of curiosity and imagination are synchronized?
I think they're I think they're attached at the hip, right? I would I would slot imagination into the creativity competency, um, because that ability and willingness to really be able to think, I mean, as cliche as it sounds, outside the box, or imagine there's no box. Um, and I think in order to do that, it needs to be triggered by curiosity. I call curiosity the gateway drug to all of these competencies. And I spoke at a conference a few years ago in Dallas, where I challenged the revered Stanford Design School on its design thinking model, which did not include curiosity. It goes from empathy, define, ideate, prototype, no, ideate, test, prototype, prototype, test. There's 5 steps. At any rate, there's no curiosity. And my challenge was that, look, you need to have this willingness to inquire in order to become empathetic. You need curiosity to understand who you're delivering a message to in order to be effective in your message sending. So curiosity first certainly helps trigger and stimulate that imagination, which I think is a fairly reasonable summation of what creativity is in the context of competencies.
Oh, for sure. Throughout the pandemic, some people have realized they need to be a better human being, not just focus on work, but also themselves, and not just physically, mentally, and spiritually. Your book is called Being Better at Being Human. Did you believe human beings weren't utilizing their strengths in a way? Because this was done before during the pandemic, but you had already started this podcast before the pandemic. So you had already been thinking ahead of, the curve, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of the planets aligned, for this kind of a book to appear, and it's by no means the only one of its kind. I mean, much to my chagrin, if it were the only one, I would probably be sitting on something much more popular and ubiquitous. But there are dozens, if not hundreds, can we categorize them as self-help or personal growth books? So mine is by no means the first. I think it's certainly one of the only ones that focuses on the actual competencies of being better. And honestly, the original subtitle of it was more along the lines of a field guide to a more competent year, or a companion guide to a more competent you. But as I cover in the book, that word competent or competencies is never going to have much sex appeal from a marketing standpoint. It causes eyes to roll or glaze over, and it just does not have much of a kick to it. Now, in the pedagogical world in academia, it means a lot because it's one of those things that someone needs to impart to students so that they can take these tools out in the workforce. But for most of us sitting here looking at a copy of a book on a bookshelf, the word competent is not going to jump out. It reeks of mediocrity. So at some point in the writing of the book, I decided that I wanted something with a little bit more punch to it, a little bit more resonance to everybody. And it was actually my wife, I think, that was trying to drag this out of me. Like, what problem is this solving? I mean, she was asking me, my wife who's a primary school teacher, was asking me, the marketing prof, the fundamental marketing question: what problem are you solving? And after moments of sheer frustration and exasperation, I said, for God's sakes, it's all about being better at being human. And she slammed her fist down, and we wrote it down quickly, and that became it. And it was only after kind of looking over all these competencies one after another that kind of spat itself out of my mouth, because my feeling was, and I think the connotation that you can read into that subtitle, is that this is all about just being nicer, being kind and generous and empathetic, and all those things are super important. They all fit nicely into the character competency and the citizenship competency in the book. But my feeling was that to be a more functional, productive member of society, to be a more well-rounded and full human being, able to chime in intelligently on conversations of all kinds. Um, respect one another, to be able to work with those, even those who you disagree with. In fact, almost flourishing when working with those who disagree. For all of these things, I felt that we owe it to our life experience, and it's to do that helps us to be better at being in these suits we call humans, right? So, so yeah, it went from a very dry kind of clinical subtitle to something that I felt was not only more resonant, but more fully described the content of the book and its purpose.
David, what do you hope that a reader will get out of your book?
I think just more cognizance of their being. Um, there is a plan to launch a series of courses on all of these competencies, digital badging, and all of this stuff, which I've not nowhere near wrapping my head around how that would look or anything. So it's not really important to me that people ratchet up their levels of critical thinking or communication by any level of magnitude, but to be more cognizant of their behavior. It is structured intentionally as a way to ritualize this way of thinking into your life. It's called the daily undoing for a reason. I mean, the podcast was called that for a reason. The book is called that for a reason. It's intended to make you just think differently about the way you go about your day. Pause before you react. Think before you hit the send button. Analyze both sides of the story. I think it's all about just the big takeaway is giving yourself a moment to think a bit about your behavior.
Mm-hmm. So self-awareness and putting away the ego or putting it aside. And
I love the self-awareness, Zach. I think that probably could have shortened my response to that one hyphenated word. Yeah.
for sure. Have students changed over the years in their thinking when it comes to marketing and innovation and creativity?
I really should know that, having now taught almost a whole generation. And it's difficult to, everything's everything's relative. I started to teach at SAIT when they were just implementing, I can't remember, it was this cheesy little acronym that had to do with laptops in classrooms, that every student was given a laptop. And now it's bring your own device, and those devices are not really laptops. A lot of times kids just bring their phones to class, right? And certainly phones can be a negative distraction, but knowing that a lot of them are recording the lectures, taking notes, capturing screenshots as I point them to a different website or whatever. Students today get a bad rap, the snowflake generation, the privileged, the entitled. But I think they've had to become more nimble and agile and certainly aware of the world around them because of the technology that they've grown up with. Whereas before, I think they had to work harder to find that, to validate their thoughts and so on.
Encyclopedias.
Yeah. And so there are two different worlds. They've changed, they've adjusted. But again, I think all in accordance to the landscape behind them.
For sure. When you look at this book, what are some of your favorite chapters and why?
Well, I mean, depending on how you look at it,
I guess episodes, let's say.
I was going to say there's like 366 chapters if you look at it that way. As we're recording, I'm now at a point in time when we're recording this in late May, and I'm thinking of what was going on in late May, and I've been talking a lot about this week in my social channels and whatnot. The George Floyd death and the fallout from that. And so right now, I seem to be kind of uber focused on the episodes around that time last year, which which I think were citizenship. Um, and I know it off by heart because I was just talking about it today on a blog, episode 157 about citizenship and really questioning ourselves. It's so easy, especially in our social media mad world, to just lunge on people and overlook our own tendencies to be prejudiced. And and so right now I'm really reflecting on that myself. I mean, I'm so quick to remind anyone who bothers to listen to me or read my stuff that this is not some dude pontificating on how the world should behave because he sort of owns that right. I kind of liken myself more to the driver of a tour bus, right? And I don't know any more than anyone else. I'm just as flawed as anyone else. I harbor thoughts that I'm not proud of. I don't communicate, even though I teach the stuff as effectively as I could or listen as much as I could. So I kind of become kind of entranced by certain times of the year and what I was thinking of a year ago as those chapters or episodes kind of came to life. There will be trigger points that'll make me think about them a lot. And some of them are very, deep and seismic in scope, like the George Floyd episode. And some of them are just, as I mentioned earlier on, very mundane. Some little trigger that one of my daughters will do or say, or something stupid that I'll see on TV or whatever, and it'll take me back. So, kind of like kids, I don't have a favorite. I just sort of dwell on one, sort of at a time.
When you look at, when we look back in time, there are certain moments that you remember it vividly. Was George Floyd's death one of them? Because for me, it's September 11th, 2001. I remember what I was doing, where I was, how I felt, what my parents were like. I remember it all. Do you remember that
Yeah,
day?
well, I mean, just hearing you say that now, Zach, because and you would have been young. I was doing my MBA at the time in Australia, so I remember those things as well very vividly. And then that is probably that landmark moment in time in my life as well. There aren't many like that. Um, and I don't think George Floyd is on that same scale. It's just one of the very lightning rod moments in a year that was marked by them, right? I have very fond memories of great relief after the November 2nd election, which also happened last year, and having to wait days before it was finally sort of decided upon. Um, and I remember the moment that Joe Biden felt confident enough to give up to stand up and give his victory speech. I remember, sitting around the table with my kids and my wife, and without getting too political about it, there's, I think, your moments that you share with people around you. You mentioned September 11th, and you know where you were, and your parents were there. I think those things seem to penetrate as well. And 2020 had a lot of them. I remember vividly the last moment I had in a Starbucks that was normal, and everybody in that Starbucks was talking about the last kind of normal coffee I had at 11th or 12th, right? I mean, I think we all, when putting the last year into perspective, we kind of have a feeling when we knew that things were about to get really, really, really serious. And I was having just a coffee in a Starbucks with a friend, and everybody around us was talking about what was happening, what was going to happen. Shutdowns were rumored to be taking place everywhere. The sky was falling. Um, I think Trudeau's wife had gone public that she had contracted the illness right at the same time. And there's this table of older men sitting beside me, and they were all just a buzz with it. Yeah, so I mean, I don't love those moments in terms of them giving me any pleasure, but I love analyzing those moments in time and just remembering where we were and how the world was behaving and reacting.
Do you think a lot of people's true colors came out during this past year?
Yeah, I do. Um, for better and for worse. I think mostly for better. Um, I remember, and I know you would have stories about this as well. I think I discovered you actually during the pandemic. I think it was during, and something that you'd posted on Instagram. You were holding these heart-shaped balloons or something,
Yes.
right? And that was sort of like an adult version of all these little stones that I started to see around the neighborhood and chalk art, right? We're in this together and everything's going to be okay. Um, I think that it brought out uh, feats of superhuman strength in kids, right? Who I think have been sort of the overlooked foot soldiers of this whole thing, who have been marching into classrooms and then told to march back out, and every day the masks and the distancing, and you know, um, and their teachers too have been unsung. Certainly the justifiable praise and uh, commendments have been given to frontline workers, which they deserve and have been heroic in their efforts. But I think just the normal people, right? You and I have, for the most part, been able to find an extra gear and have hopefully done a little reflection ourselves, and all those things that we were hearing at the beginning, that this is the universe's way of telling us to slow down and stop. And I think there's some degree of thought there for sure, and hopefully it has. I mean, as we're talking here today, we've got news in our province that we're going to be able to flick a switch in July and revert back to normal. It's high risk, high reward, right? I mean, if it works and it jumpstarts the economy and restores consumer confidence, and that's an awesome dog.
He sleeps right here. That's why sometimes my hand goes down here and I look like ridiculous. I'm like this, swimming around.
I'll bring mine over one day. We can go for a walk along the river.
That'd be nice. Yeah. So I mean, it's all a journey, and I don't know. People say, "Well, Zach, let me interview you," or "What's your story?" And I don't really have a story, Dave. That's the interesting part about all this. I don't have a story yet to put together, or I haven't had the chance to pause and say, "What is my life story?" Because I'm
Well, from my perspective, I would argue that assertion. I think I kind of see what you're trying to say, but I mean, I'm dying to get into the weeds with how I still don't know. It's still a bit of a mystery to me how you became what you have become.